15 minutes, this will be kind of the speed run of NoSQL and security. And by the way, there is a question mark at the end. That is important. I don't want to say there is no security in NoSQL, because sometimes people misunderstand. So I work for Elastic, one of the companies in that space. I don't want to dive too deep into our products or anything here. I want to get started with what are the most used NoSQL data stores right now? So there's this page, dbengines.com, which is basically the ranking of what are the most popular data stores. This is the June version, and you can see MongoDB is the #1 NoSQL store, followed up by Redis and then Elasticsearch. And these are the three I want to dive into and take a quick look at what security means for those. If you have any questions, I use Slido. I won't have probably time to answer any questions during the talk. If you want to ask anything, ask the question there. I will tweet out the answers after the talk. Just go to slido.do/my Twitter handle, ask there, and I will tweet out the answers afterwards. So this is the only thing to remember. Let's get started. So who knows little Bobby tables, like one of the XKCD comics where it's like, if you don't follow the right naming conventions for your children, maybe bad stuff happens. Is this still an issue with NoSQL data stores? Well, some people say the good thing about NoSQL is that, well, without SQL there can be NoSQL injections. This is not meant literally. This is more of a joke. That person knows very well that there are still problems. So let's talk about MongoDB. Some people say now that they're public, they don't only lose your data, but also your money. But joking aside about MongoDB, let's see what they're doing for security. Injections are still a thing. Even though it's not SQL, you get JavaScript injections instead then, because they support JavaScript. So what that could look like, this was Diaspora, which wanted to be the Facebook killer 5, 6, whatever years ago, maybe 8. And they wrote code like this. And this is bad for two reasons. Like you can see here, they're doing regular expressions, so they pass in a query here, and you can run the regular expression. This will be very slow, because it will be single-threaded, it cannot use an index, it will be slow, and B, it's unsecure, because you're passing in a random script here. Don't do this, because suddenly you have not SQL injections, but instead JavaScript injections. There are quite some functions that they support which are problematic. Eval is kind of obvious, but all these can have injections if you pass in a random string. So don't do that. If you can, disable scripting entirely. Basically, if you don't use JavaScript in your scripting, just disable it and be done with the entire problem. And then there was this thing, this is the only German slide, don't worry. This was basically a university discovered 40,000 unsecured MongoDB instances on the internet. That was in 2015. And people found that interesting, but they didn't know how to make money out of that. And as it often happens, universities first or academia, and it takes some time to people understand what to do with that. And then it took some time, 2 years or so, until people figured out, we can make money out of that by taking the data ransom and asking for cryptocurrencies in exchange. And this has targeted a lot of data stores. So anything that is unsecured, people will just log in, potentially download your data, delete the data, and then say, if you want to have that data that I have copied back, pay here, and I will give you your data back. If they really took that backup and will give the data back to you is up for discussion. Because I've heard people say they just say that they took the backup, but actually they didn't. So you can pay, but you might not get your data back. Don't rely on that. So the general question is MongoDB bound to all interfaces by default? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? So they did change that. Since 3.6, it's definitely not the case anymore. Before, it was not the case for popular packages like RPM and DBM packages for a few years already, but now it's disabled everywhere. So everybody who got ransomed actually changed the binding of the network interface. Because by default, it's just localhost. Somebody changed that and exposed it to the internet. Is authentication enabled by default? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? Yeah, unfortunately, it is not. So you will need to enable that explicitly. So you have a parameter auth, which you need to set, and then authentication is enabled, which is kind of a shame because MongoDB's security is actually very good. So they used to have an old implementation called MongoDB CR for challenge response. Now they are using an IETF standard, which is very good. It's Scram SHA-1, and since, or in 4.0, they're going for Scram SHA-256. I think Postgres 10 added the same security approaches. So they're using an official standard, they have implemented that, so that's a good thing and the right approach to do stuff. And they have, yeah, a lot of settings that make sense. What they do, we don't want to go into the details. They also have a lot of predefined roles. So you don't need to do much configuration. You just need to turn on configuration, set a user, and then apply that user. It's generally very good, and you could assume, well, you can just do this happy dance, and people are very successful with MongoDB security. The main downside is you still need to enable security, and you know, most people don't, and then complain. But that's hard to solve. And since version 3, SSL is also included nearly everywhere. So they're doing a lot of the right things. Next up, Redis. By the way, who's using Redis? Just a quick show of hands. Who was using MongoDB? Because I kind of forgot to ask. Okay, that's fewer. Okay, Redis is also very widely used. There was a recent blog post by a security research firm which said like 75% of the open Redis servers are infected by or are often mining cryptocurrencies. That's basically what the report came down to. Why was that possible? Because it's kind of easy to break out of an open Redis server. So Salvatore, the author, or with the handle Antiris, the author of Redis, he even wrote a blog post back in 2015, if you have full access to Redis, how to break out of that and then run whatever commands you want on that instance. So don't make your Redis instances publicly available because there will be trouble. He was open enough to actually show how to do it or approximately how to do it, just so that you know what not to do. Don't fall for that trap. Does Redis bind to all interfaces by default? Who thinks yes? Who thinks no? Redis does, but since more recent version with the so-called protected mode. And that is actually very clever. So Redis binds to all interfaces, and if you ping it, it will tell or answer your query on localhost, but from remote, it will tell you, you have not set this up correctly. You need to configure this server correctly, and only then will I answer your query. So while the interface is bound and you can talk to Redis, it will not answer your queries from a remote host. Which is kind of a nice approach or middle ground for having something that is usable because it tells you what to do. While still not compromising security, though they have only added that like 1.5 years or so ago with Redis 3.2. But that is an interesting feature that I have not seen in any data store, that it will actually tell you what to configure in order to use it. The other thing about authentication is they call it themselves a tiny layer of authentication, but there is no authorization whatsoever at the moment. So yeah, even their own documentation says tiny layer, and if somebody says in their own documentation tiny, it's probably really tiny. So what they have is you can have a password, one password for the entire instance, and that's it. It's stored in plain text in the Redis configuration. The bad thing is there is no SSL, so over the wire, whoever can sniff your traffic will be able to get that. The other thing is Redis is very fast at responding to queries. So if you want to brute force that one password, it will be also very fast. So pick a good password for that. Otherwise, you will do tens of thousands of requests per second, and Redis will happily serve them, and you can just try out passwords. There is no rate limiting or any limitation on that whatsoever. The other very important thing about Redis is that it's hiding commands. So you can just say in the Redis configuration that you hide a command, or you can set it through the API. So here, for example, I'm renaming the command config to my secret config name. So you cannot use config anymore. You need to call my secret config name to actually use that feature. So it's just a different name or a mapping of the feature. You can also disable commands entirely by giving them a blank string as a name. Then you cannot use them anymore. And there are some features which you might want to disable for production, and you can just do that. This is also very unique in Redis that they are having like this hiding or disabling of commands, but there is no authorization to allow specific commands or not. You can just do that globally. Don't pass in random Lua scripts because, well, scripting is a thing, and Salvatore also recently stated that eval as a command, he sees that as a feature, but once you pass in random Lua scripts, well, eval does whatever you give to that. And also, scripting is often a pain. Since it's Lua, people every now and then find ways to break out of the sandbox of Lua. Just recently, they had to run a round of security fixes because people were able to break out of the Lua sandbox. Okay. In the future, they promised access control lists and TLS on the wire, but that will only be Redis 6. Like, we're at version 4 now, they're working on 5 at the moment, so 6 will be out sometime in the future, we'll see. Okay, Elasticsearch. Does Elasticsearch bind to all interfaces? It used to, but it doesn't do that anymore. Does it broadcast to all the nodes on the local subnet to form a cluster? It's also something that we learned not to do anymore. Can you run Elasticsearch as root? Anybody thinks that? Because you cannot. We, by now, check, are you running the server process as root? And we will system exit if you try to do that. People commonly agreed that this was a bad practice and you shouldn't do that. But with Docker, people suddenly came back to that and said, like, oh, we'll just run everything as root in our Docker container. We'll still system exit. The only way around that is to fork the source code and comment out that system exit. We will not get rid of that otherwise. Scripting. For Elasticsearch, scripting was often a pain point. So these are all the security issues that we had in Elasticsearch over the time. And these are the ones that were related to scripting. And you can also see the most severe one were all related to scripting. So what did we do? We got rid of general scripting, and we wrote our own scripting language called Painless. So basically, we hired somebody, and he developed that for 1 year. And then there is the obvious question, do you really need another scripting language? And well, we even wrote a blog post about that, why we think this is a good idea. Generally, we did it for 2 reasons. Security and performance. Since it's not a general purpose programming language, we can kind of limit the feature scope and only implement stuff that we think we can do in a secure way. The other thing is the Groovy scripts are always reinterpreted whenever you ran them. By now we have a cache that the scripts are cached and will be faster once you rerun them. Scripting is pretty simple. Like, I don't think there is anything too spectacular in there. Basically, if you don't have a value, we will initialize 1. Otherwise, we'll just increment the value. That's all that is happening here. And it pretty much looks like Java or anything that you're used to here. Painless is now the default scripting, and in version 6 we have removed the other scripting languages for performance and security reasons. We're sorry if you have to change that, but in the long run this is the best for everybody. Authentication and authorization. Unfortunately, that is how we earn money, so people sometimes complain about that. Just to give you a quick idea of what happens, so Shodan is, they basically crawl the internet and you can see everything that is running Elasticsearch and responds, or running on port 9200, which is the default, and responds with a 200 OK. And then you can basically just pick one of these instances and say, okay, show me what data you have. And you can see there is this index called please read. And that please read, since we're nice, we're just reading that index. This was an actual instance on the internet. And then it will tell you, okay, we have backed up your data, send 0.5 Bitcoin to this address, and then we'll give you back your data. This is what a ransom database looks like. And you will find various kinds of, like any kind of database, you will probably find something that has been ransomed and looks like this. And depending on the price of Bitcoin, which is fluctuating a lot now, this can be more or less. And I've actually seen when Bitcoin was going up so much that people switched back to dollars because Bitcoin a week later would be double the price, or almost double the price. So people have switched to dollar prices by now. The other thing that I've seen is the matryoshka, that somebody ransoms your data and then leaves this note where to get your original data back. And then somebody else ransoms that data, takes a backup of that, and then leaves another message. And basically, you need to pay one to get the message of the next, and maybe at the very end, you get the original data back. Maybe. Yeah. And, for example, in Germany, if you run a German server, they might tell you if you have an open Elasticsearch instance running. This is what happened when we had an open test instance running somewhere on one of our nodes. So to wrap up, injections are still a thing. Don't pass in random scripts. Just because it's not SQL, it can still be a scripting injection. Enable security by default. I hope all the vendors will do that over time, but this seems to be a learning process. Be creative like Redis or not with the protected mode and hiding of commands. Custom scripting can still make sense. And security just takes time, because that's the reason why NoSQL is not there yet. And with that, I'm afraid we're out of time. If you have questions, come to me afterwards, or ask on Slido and I will answer there. Thanks a lot.